I paid the Australian government $350,000 just on income tax last year. Now, if you've done your tax return already, you would have received this. It's the tax receipt that showcases all the different areas the Australian government spends your hard-earned. And so I thought it'd be fun in this video to break down some of the areas, what our money gets us versus other countries, talk about some of the sneaky bits that catch you off guard, but also 3 areas that I think Australia could be doing way better. Okay, if you're new to the channel, you're probably wondering, why does this guy have such a big tax bill? Well, a bunch of years ago, I started a company with some friends. It's now worth a lot, and we sold some shares. And so now I'm spending my time teaching young Australians on how to get ahead, building prosperity for the nation with personal leverage. So if that sounds like your kind of mission, chuck me a sub and check out the newsletter. It's in the description. The biggest bar is for welfare, and it's broken down into a bunch of sub areas such as aged care, disability, families, unemployed, and the mysterious other. Compared to other advanced economies, we actually have a much lower percent of spend in some of these areas, like aged care, where Australia spends 2.6% of GDP compared to OECD nations, which are closer to 9%.
And we have our super to thank for that one.
And later in the video, when we talk about what I'd change about the tax receipt, we'll also talk about the elephant in the room. Yes, the NDIS. Okay, so the next chart of note is Australian healthcare. I started Govt, which is a healthcare company, and I'm a huge believer in Australian healthcare. I mean, I spent $62,000 on healthcare as a portion of my tax last year. I think that's the price of a kidney. So if you've got a new kidney, you're welcome, I guess. I think the best way to assess the success of Australian healthcare is how much we spend compared to our lifespan. And we spend about $6,000 per person and have a life expectancy of 84 years. And if you compare that to other healthy European countries like Switzerland, etc., they spend more, closer to $8,000, and they have a lower life expectancy. One area Australian healthcare needs to improve is in its efficiency. And you can expect these numbers to flatline rather than improve in the next few years, unless Australia is willing to make great leaps forward. So the next one is defense. Now, I spent $30,000 on defense last year and bought our boys and girls some machine guns. I was actually hoping that number would be bigger. You see, Australia is 15th in the world in how much we spend on defense. But if you look at that spend as a percent of GDP, we're actually plummet to 26th in the world. Now, defense spending is all the rage at the moment, post Russia and Ukraine, and the European countries are actually raising their spend to 5% of GDP. I guess the question is, will Australia do the same? Should we do the same? Well, we'll get to that later in the video. And then the last one to call out is probably education. We've basically got a semi-privatized education system, given that so many people go to private schools. I myself went to a public school, had a great experience and a full believer in it, but I think the real question about education is around our spend when it relates to early childhood. And the Nordic countries, those beautiful utopias such as Sweden, Norway, they do outspend us here. Again, maybe there's an opportunity here. We'll get to that soon. So what are some other things to note here? Well, up the top, you can see government gross debt. Okay, these numbers look massive, but compared to other nations in the Western world, they're actually pretty good. In fact, our debt to GDP ratio is around 35%. Compare that to the standard of 60% or above for the OECD. And the United States at the moment is having massive upheaval around this very number. You'll be happy to know that in comparison to the rest of the world, Australia is actually reasonably fiscally responsible, apart from Victoria, when it comes to government spending. But the next thing to talk about is a few of the sneaky bits that actually shocked me once I dug into this. So the first thing to note is that this tax picture is actually half the story, or technically slightly less than half the story. You see, personal income tax is the biggest chunk of tax the government gets, but it's by no means the only. You can see here, individual income tax, but also company taxes, goods and services tax. So that's 10% on all our products, and that actually goes straight to the state governments. We've got super fund taxes, which get taken out of your super very sneakily. And additionally, it doesn't take into account state-based taxes. So when you register your car, or when you pay stamp duty, you're actually paying another set of taxes to the state government. And then another set of taxes to your local government through rates, etc. Now, the other really interesting thing is the interest on government debt. Quite often the government will use debt to pay for big projects, to fund things like the NBN or various national infrastructure projects. And so where that hits us every year is through this interest line item. Sometimes I'm pretty gloomy about Australia, but documents like this remind me that things could be worse, and that if we shuffle a few numbers around, maybe things will get a lot better. And so the first change I would make is to the disability line item, specifically the NDIS. And I would hone in on one particular problem in the NDIS, which is the fact that so many young boys, up to 16% of them, are actually accessing the NDIS for autism. To me, you cannot blame parents for this, but this represents a failure of our education system, which we're already under indexing on. You see, we love talking about public schools, private schools, secondary, tertiary, but we're missing a huge opportunity, and that is to nationalize early childhood. You see, we've got this massive industry of semi-private education in the form of childcare centres, where basically they're run like private businesses, but the government are paying massive rebates. I say, just rip the Band-Aid off, pay a little bit more, and nationalize the whole system. You'll improve the quality. We already know that when well-funded Australian schooling systems are great, and you'd bring us closer in line to what's working in the Nordic countries. And hey, if we want the birth rate to go up, we're going to make life easier for young parents to have kids. This is not just an investment in our youth. This is not just an investment in our birth rate. This is allowing parents to work to further increase our productivity. And again, with more funding at the early stages, we're going to pick up kids that have signs of autism before they're 7 and deal with it within the system. And we're not creating added complexity. Okay, so the next change I'd make is to get the defense spending number up. Yeah, okay, well, it seems controversial to recommend we spend more on war and material, etc. But the thing is that increasing defense spending in this day and age, in modern warfare, actually reduces the likelihood of war. You are basically creating porcupines out of nations like Australia, but also much smaller ones that need to defend themselves. And increasingly that becomes a war of cost. Who has the most material? Who can fight for the longest? It's a war till bankruptcy, in essence. Now, you might have seen some of the footage from the Ukraine war featuring drones. Absolute nightmare fuel. But from it, it seems clear that the future of war is very much drone orientated. Those who have a capability to produce drones will be at a huge advantage. And at the moment, that's China. China produces 90% of the world's drones. The other 10% use many parts that come from China. So Australia is faced with an opportunity. Continue to spend heaps of money on expensive treaties or old ways of fighting, or start to develop some of the capability of building drones and related military technologies here in Australia. In fact, Silicon Valley got its start in the 70s developing technologies for the US military. We're talking Fairchild Semiconductor, we're talking DARPANET, the precursor to the internet, etc. And there are some great Australian companies operating in this space already. The last change I'd make is to the very small and very boring line item industry assistance, where I spent $5,893 last year, aka not enough. What is industry assistance? Well, it includes things like Australia's R&D grant, where companies can get a whole bunch of money back for proving that the things that they made were actually innovative and contributed to the future of the Australian economy. Now, the problem is that Australia kind of treats R&D grants a bit like a charity. The Australian expenditure on R&D is some of the worst in the Western world, but this is where the seeds of the future are planted. So we're going to shift the mindset from one of R&D charity to co-investment. Basically, the government coming in as silent investors to critical industries and putting their thumb on the scales and making sure that that industry has a global chance of being competitive. And so many developed countries around the world do this. So many. And we only tend to do it really randomly, like $1 billion here on quantum computing or shitloads on NBN, that kind of thing. But now we do need to shift our mindset. Now we've got all these smart cookies in universities and research labs for sure, but we actually haven't produced that much of note. We keep harping on about the Wi-Fi, the cochlear implant, their bloody hills hoist. It's time to ask the question, what is next? There is an opportunity here for Australian government money to go into important industries. Take minerals processing, for example. We could actually be doing way more with the lithium that we just dig out of the ground and put on boats and ship over to China. And then China turns them into batteries and we ship them back. The thing is, China is spending a huge amount of government money to make those processes competitive. And yeah, they're decades ahead, but that doesn't mean that we can't start. This whole batteries thing is going to be a huge industry. And that's just one industry. There are scores more where the government could get involved. And the beauty of it is the government investing in these industries is a huge signal to the rest of the market. We've got $4.3 trillion of superannuation sitting there looking for a home. And when they see that the government is investing in Australian industry, hell, that really paves the way for that money to flow in. We can turn a unique thing about Australia, the super funds, into a huge unfair advantage. This could be the start of the build here in Australia mindset. The mindset that's for so many years we haven't dug deep enough on. It's true, it's going to be unviable at the start, but when you've got that government money involved, it could be so much better. Okay, now I can already hear the doomers in the comments saying, oh, those things aren't viable, we should stick to what we know, the labor's too expensive, the energy's too expensive. So many of the things that we've talked about here are uniquely Australian. Medicare, the good parts of the NDIS, superannuation, those started out as silly ideas, but someone had the absolute stones to push through with them. Basically, how can we get smart with the items on this piece of paper so the things that we spend money on end up flowing back to the country? They end up paying dividends. That sounds like a pretty good idea from where I'm standing, and broadly, I'm optimistic. So that's it. Love yous all. Catch you next time, and yibbity yibbita.